As we begin, what we did is I asked one of our colleagues merely to think of a date and to write it down, tear the piece of paper off, and save it. Because tonight, what we're going to be talking about is disasters, legal issues with regard to emergencies and disasters. So we want to hold on to that. And while we're at it, we may even do something else. I have a calendar here, and if I may, I'm going to hand the calendar. May I hand you the calendar? And I'll just have you hold on to that. Just keep the rubber band on it and hold on to it. And I'm going to ask you, please, just to think. I won't have you say it yet, but I just want you to think of any date, month and day between January 1st and December 31st. So you can think of any date, March 10th, April 5th, whatever day you would like, whatever date. You've already selected a year at random. And I'm going to ask you, please, just to think of any date, month and day. And what would you like?
September 25th.
September 25th. Please remember that, okay? September 25th. Very good. Just tuck that away. Everybody will remember that, okay? We get ready to begin. Okay. We're going to be talking about legal and ethical issues in disaster. And for those of you who recently completed medical jurisprudence and medical ethics, you're aware that our legal system in the United States is based upon a document, and that is the United States Constitution. That Constitution establishes our court system, our legislative system, and our executive system. Now we have a single constitution for the United States, the federal, and then we have constitutions in each of the states. Constitution for the federal government, as well as the constitutions in each of the states, establish agencies as well. And these agencies promulgate, that means they can create rules and regulations to which we as citizens must adhere. And they create agencies, and one of the agencies that's created is FEMA, and that's for emergencies, federal emergencies. And so one of the things we're going to look at is how that is accessed. We also know that the United States Constitution has amendments, and we know that one of the amendments, the 10th Amendment, guarantees that everything that is not relegated and delegated to the federal government is relegated and delegated to the states and the people. So we know that there can be conflicts between the states and the federal government. And we're going to look at that as well when it comes to issues of emergency and disaster. We also know that the amendments, there's the Bill of Rights, the 5th and the 14th Amendments, and those, as you've read in your studies for this course, provide us equal protection under the law and due process. And what that means is that rights and privileges, guaranteed rights and privileges, cannot just be easily foregone. We are protected. However, this changes when it comes to emergencies and disasters. So we'll look at that as well. Disasters occur locally, based upon legally established pathways that can move to state intervention and then from there to federal intervention. So we have the state FEMAs, we have then the governor through the Stafford Act. We'll have slides on all this. I'm just giving you, you know how I function. I give you the big overview, then we go back and look at it, and then I review so you all remember it. We know that the Stafford Act is what allows the governor of the state to contact the President of the United States to have a disaster declared so that FEMA can then be activated. And the governor may also access federal assistance via the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Disasters require the imposition of state and/or federal emergency powers. Now, what are these federal emergency powers? We call them the police powers. We call them that because it means that they're able to regulate and police us, restrict us from doing things, command us to do things. There are restrictions over property and restrictions over people. We'll look at that. After 9/11, it was discovered that while we have agencies, organizations, rules and regulations that cover the grid of the world, we did not have anything in place for a major disaster in the United States. And it was at that point that the Command for North America was established. We'll see that in a slide in a minute. In maintaining the balance between state and federal control and state-federal identity, 3 acts limit the use of federal intervention into the states. The 3 acts that limit federal intervention into the states are, first one coming out of 1807, the Thomas Jefferson era. This was the Insurrection Act, and it was this act that limited the use of federal forces in the states. The second was the Posse Comitatus Act, and that comes from 1878. That came out of the Reconstruction era, coming out of the Civil War, and that requires Congress to act before there can be a use of federal forces to engage in law enforcement activities in the states. And then the Stafford Act, which we mentioned, that 1988, is a process through which federal intervention can be accessed for help in emergencies and disasters in the states. Once a disaster is declared, the 3 R's of ethics come into play. The 3 R's of ethics are responsibility, restrictions, and resource allocation. What is responsibility? It's the duty to treat. Even though we as healthcare providers may be at risk of being injured or contracting some type of disaster illness, we have a duty, a responsibility to treat. Now, how we treat, that can be limited, and we will see that when it comes to crisis care standards. We'll talk about that momentarily. Then come restrictions, so as to protect the uninjured, so as to protect the still healthy and still well. Restrictions on liberty may be imposed. What kinds of restrictions? We'll talk about those. Those restrictions are the restrictions such as quarantine, and I'll repeat this again later, which involves the separation or restriction of movement of healthy people, exposed or potentially exposed. There's isolation, that separates those known to already be ill or infected from the rest of the community. We have social distancing. This is where we limit activities. We reduce exposure risk by closing areas of communal gathering, schools, churches, canceling events. That is social distancing. And curfew. Curfew imposes a time limit on population activity within a community as a way to minimize high-risk behaviors. Then we have, during a disaster, resources may become limited. So we have resource allocation and rationing. And included within that may be crisis standards of care, which we will discuss. We know that in bioethics, Beauchamp and Childress, in the 1970s, they presented us with the concepts of autonomy, or autonomos, self-rule from the Greek word, autonomy, beneficence, doing good, non-maleficence, which is primum non nocere, above all else do no harm, and justice. It is from autonomy that we derive our concept of the individual's right to self-rule of his or her body, so that he or she has to receive informed consent for treatment and has the right for informed refusal. And it is from justice that we have allocation of resources. When we have the limitation on resources, then we allocate them. We restrict who receives what care and how they receive that care. And that comes out of the bioethical principles that we apply in crisis intervention, crisis standards of care. While different states may have different standards with regard to liability and freedom from legal liability, as well as compensation with regard to caregivers during an emergency, there is the universal standard in all states that we must avoid willful, wanton, and gross negligence any time we intervene to provide care. During a disaster, two key federal regulations may be waived. The Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, or EMTALA, may be waived during a disaster, and HIPAA may be waived during a disaster. During a disaster, the standard of medical care becomes contextual. That means we provide care based upon the context of the environment wherein the disaster is occurring. And we may then implement what's called expectant care. Expectant care means individuals who have been triaged and we realize may not survive, we will provide comfort care. That is the concept of expectant care. What can be expected under the circumstances based on resource allocation and based upon the severity of injuries. Pre-planning for a disaster situation is critical because we want to avoid the concept of ad hoc care. That's the reason you all are here today, tomorrow. You're here because you are planning. You are being prepared so that should an emergency, should a disaster occur, you all will be able to participate appropriately and effectively in that disaster. We don't want individuals just volunteering without any background and training because, unfortunately, they, through ad hoc volunteerism, may become more of the problem than the solution. So again, we want to avoid ad hoc care. Learning objectives. After tonight, you'll be able to describe general legal and regulatory framework for disaster response. We'll discuss the three core ethical issues common in disaster planning and response. You already know those, the three R's: responsibility, restrictions, and resource allocation, or rationing. And explain the standard of care in disasters. We talked about that. Expectant care and or the crisis standards of care. Individual rights. We talked about due process and the equal protection provided by the United States Constitution through the 5th and 14th Amendments, guaranteeing everyone equal protection under the law, and that we have due process before rights and privileges are terminated or restricted. When are we able to restrict those rights? We're able to restrict those rights when there is a compelling interest. What is a compelling interest? A disaster or an emergency. Well-targeted interventions. We're specific about what rights we are limiting and at what time and for what reason. And we seek to use the least restrictive means. We want to restrict those rights to the least amount necessary to achieve and accomplish our goal. Bless you, in intervening and treating. And due process. Due process means that an individual's rights are not restricted without the appropriate use of the legal system. We know that in a disaster, in an emergency situation, that we may have to limit due process at that time because of the need to protect and save. Federal roles. Now, there is a difference, as we mentioned, states and federal. Federal government is able to do what it does based upon the Constitution of the United States, which provides the regulation of the federal government and what they can implement as their powers. As you notice here, interstate commerce is regulated by the federal government. National defense is regulated by the federal government. Taxing and spending for the public welfare is regulated by the federal government, as are others, including and not limited to providing an army for national defense and waging war. Coining of money is also federal government. Creating postal roads, also created under the U.S. Constitution. State roles. We know that the state has its place in regulating our lives, and so the state provides public health, the police powers of the state, regulating us with state statutes, state regulations. State is mandated to protect public health and welfare, and it has public health emergency powers where it can intervene. Bless you. Public health emergency powers. When we think about the public health emergency powers, we have, as you notice here, surveillance, power over property, reporting, investigation, social distancing, which we talked about, evacuation, vaccination, isolation. When we talk about public health emergency powers, we are talking about state intervention to provide safety, and using that police power in an emergency situation may limit the rights, privileges, and freedoms that we have under the state constitution. In declaring a disaster, remember, disasters occur locally, and then they become the responsibility of the state, and the state has the option then of declaring through the necessary pathways federal emergency. Process for disaster declaration starts with the state. This then triggers the public health emergency powers. The state can then request federal assistance, which can then be provided either by the Secretary of Health and Human Services for a public health emergency, or the President of the United States via the Stafford Act, as we talked about, Stafford Act having been promulgated in 1988. States' rights remain vital in defining a balance between the state and federal government. Often the question is asked for disasters: why can't the federal government intervene without state intervention and state invitation? The U.S. has a rich tradition of protecting states' rights and limiting federal power. We talked earlier about 1807, the Insurrection Act, Thomas Jefferson. We talked about 1878, Posse Comitatus, that came about after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, and the Stafford Act. And here they are. These limit federal intervention because the states are very, very protective of citizens' rights within the state and the state's ability to provide services for its own citizens. All initial response to disasters is local. This makes practical and political sense. We have then a local commander, incident commander, and there is a state coordinating officer and the governor, and we have a state National Guard, and then coordination of federal asset response occurs between the respective coordinating officers, local, state, and federal. Another tier in the federal response occurs when the Department of Defense, through defense response to civil authorities, use of federal military assets occurs through coordination between the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Secretary of the Department of Defense. Again, it was after 9/11 that the Northern Command was created. And this is a diagram, a slide, illustrating what we just discussed. And you'll notice in the center the local incident commander, the state coordinating officer, the federal coordinating officer, and then the defense coordinating officer through the U.S. Northern Command. So you can see we have the local executive, the governor, who then can access the federal government through the president, through the Stafford Act, or through the Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is the pathway. The local area seeks to provide its own care first, and then it enlists the state through the governor. The governor may then take the disaster federal through the President of the United States or the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Again, remember, we talked about the 3 R's, the 3 ethical R's. Responsibility to care despite personal risk. So the duty to treat. Restrictions on liberty. We can restrict liberty to ensure protection of the uninjured, to include the application, as we mentioned earlier, of quarantine, isolation, social distancing, and curfew. And resource allocation or rationing. These are the 3 R's of ethics in disaster response. Again, duty to treat. We may use quarantine, isolation, social distancing, and even though it's not shown on the slide, curfew. The duty to treat extends from the social contract between caregivers and society. We as physicians have an unwritten contract to provide health and well-being to society. The benefits of professional status are accepted by fulfilling these known obligations. The duty to treat also derives from the special training that we have that generates for us special capabilities to provide the care that individuals need in a disaster. The duty to treat includes non-discrimination based on those with disease. We cannot refuse care of infected patients. This became a hot issue when HIV first came onto the scene. And we cannot discriminate against individuals because of their illness or their injury. We've seen this with Ebola. We saw this with HIV. We may see this again in the future should we have some other type of biological disaster. So again, the duty to treat. It's a social contract that we as physicians have with society. And we have a moral obligation. Because of our special training, we are held to be capable. We have proximity to members of our community. Based upon the degree of need, we provide the care, and when there are no other sources available, we're here. We cannot discriminate. The duty to treat and to serve may put us at personal risk. Police and firefighters have a 1 to 5% greater risk through their lifetime of mortality on the job. There are limits to the duty to treat, however. Individual casualties exist within a community of casualties. Reciprocal social obligations ensure that those providing care have reasonable provisions against harm. So when we treat, we have to be given protection ourselves so that we have protective devices, protective outfits that we can wear. We have to have the ability to maintain our own personal safety, because if we don't maintain our safety, we may become casualties. We then burden the limited resources even more. And there is no absolute universal threshold for treatment in context treatment. In the context of a disaster, we may have to resort to crisis standards of care. Crisis standards of care, that means that we provide that care which is relevant to that individual at that moment based upon the context. So there's no absolute universal threshold of care. Now, there's a spectrum of caregiver behavior that exists across duty, heroism, and recklessness. We have a duty to provide care. We may go above and beyond what would usually be customary in a disaster, thus heroism. We want to avoid recklessness. Recklessness can create another casualty, that is us, and can waste resources that are needed for the other casualties of a disaster. Volunteer and worker compensation. Different states have different guidelines, different rules with regard to the compensation of workers and volunteers in a disaster. This will be based upon the state in which you find yourself, and I mean the geographical state, not the emotional state. Some volunteers are considered to be temporary employees. They may be eligible for benefits from the institution for whom they are serving. Others are purely volunteers. So again, it depends upon the state in which you find yourself serving. And in many jurisdictions, a volunteer's existing employer may not be liable for injury to that volunteer as an employee. So again, it's important to find out what your state, where you are, provides and allows for that. So too with licensure and credentialing. States regulate licensure. Healthcare facilities and payers regulate credentialing. In declared disasters, licensure may be waived. In fact, what we tend to see, there are state compacts, and there are, in fact, some state organizations and federal organizations, so that if you are licensed in one state, during an emergency, based on state compacts, you may be able to provide care as if you were licensed in that other state in which you don't have a license. So states will allow for an expansion of this concept of licensure in an emergency and a disaster. Federal healthcare providers need only be licensed in one state to perform their official duties in any state. And these cover uniformed services, Veterans Administration, and those in federalized disaster medical assistance treatment teams. Again, one of the keys to keep in mind is there is no immunity for criminal liability, meaning willful actions that cause harm. There's no immunity for that. Willful, wanton, and gross negligence is not excused, even in a disaster or emergency situation. Again, there are mutual aid compacts between the states, Good Samaritan statutes, and different states have different Good Samaritan statutes. State emergency health power statutes. There's the UEVHPA that provides for many of the volunteers. Federalized providers have civil immunity, not criminal immunity. And the, you'll note here we talked about that. Uniform Emergency Volunteer Health Practitioner Act, that's the UEVHPA. This was promulgated by the National Conference of Commissioners on the Uniform State Laws in 2006. It was amended in 2007. The purpose of this was to develop a uniform and coordinated approach to quickly deploy health practitioners to disaster areas. This is triggered by the declaration of an emergency by an authorized state or local official, and it's in effect for the duration of the emergency, and it applies to all licensed volunteer practitioners who provide health or veterinary services. We talked about ad hoc care. We don't want ad hoc care. We want organized care. We want individuals who are trained. We want individuals who are part of a team. And we want individuals who understand what it means to be activated and to help and not get in the way. We talked about these. What types of restrictions may be allowed and provided for in a disaster, in an emergency, when the issues of due process and the issues of equal protection of the law may have to be abrogated for that period of time so that we can minimize the potential impact of the disaster. Quarantine. Remember, quarantine involves separation or restriction of movement of healthy people who have been exposed or those who have potentially been exposed, yet are not showing signs or symptoms of an illness at this time. Isolation. This separates those already known to be ill or infected from the rest of the community. Social distancing means that we limit activities in the hopes of limiting the amount of transmission of illness. And curfew, again, we impose a time limit on a population so that their activity is limited, hoping to minimize high-risk behaviors. We're trying to find a balance between personal liberty, the rights and privileges guaranteed under the Constitution of both the federal government and the states, and public safety. So what we're looking at is the context. Disasters, emergencies are all about context. Again, the United Nations Conference in Syracuse, Greece, provided guidelines for the initiation of coercive public health measures. They want the least restrictive means to be applied, and the general ethical principle is to do no harm. John Mills was a philosopher. He defined the harm principle in the context of restrictions of liberty, stating, and I quote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." So again, in our quest to prevent harm to others, we find ourselves in this ethical dilemma of having to restrict the rights of others. The effectiveness of any intervention relies on many factors. And what we found in past disasters, if we plan to implement a quarantine, if we plan to isolate individuals, if we seek to utilize social distancing, and if we plan to impose a curfew, number one, the community has to believe in the officials who are doing this. If the community does not believe in these individuals, then the imposition of a curfew, social distancing, isolation, or quarantine may go awry. And what's been found, if there is not this social cohesiveness, this trust, this understanding of what's going on, we may find that individuals flee. So instead of containing the potential for transmission of illness or the exacerbation of a current disaster, we may exacerbate it because the individuals don't trust their leaders, they are fearful, and so when they flee, they may take the disease with them. And this has been found to have happened in other circumstances. Real human behavior comes into play. Individuals have their survival instinct. They become fearful. They panic if officials overreact. Effective communication is critical. We have to be able to communicate to the citizens the reason that we are implementing certain restrictive guidelines, rules, and regulations. And we also find that mass screening oftentimes is not very effective. What does quarantine sacrifice? It sacrifices job protection. Individuals are not able to perform their family's duties. There's a fear of overcrowding if we quarantine large groups of people. Exposure to the illness. Individuals become frightened if they're quarantined, that there may be other individuals in the quarantine area who are already exposed, and now they're at risk of being exposed because they're stuck in a quarantined area. Stigma of being quarantined. There's this fear of discrimination in being quarantined, loss of privacy, and this generates and creates mental health issues. Individuals may suffer from anxiety. We may see post-traumatic stress disorder based upon our thoughtful intervention. We see this with the individuals who come back to the United States who may have been exposed to Ebola and yet show no signs or symptoms. They've been isolated, quarantined, and we've seen what happens with that. We've seen the angst it creates, the fear in the community, and we've seen the anger it's generated in those who have been placed into a quarantine. The waiver of federal rights, as we discussed. In an emergency situation, when the President declares the emergency or the Health and Human Services Secretary declares a public health emergency, both HIPAA, which is federal, and the EMTALA, which is federal, may be waived. Potential rationing principles. How do we determine how to ration? Well, we look at, if we ration, will we save more lives? Do we want to save more life years so the individuals we do save are more productive in the years they have left? Do we want to save a certain segment of our population, women and children? Do we want to ration on a first-come, first-served basis? Do we want to ration based upon those who are willing to pay the most for the limited resources available? And that's a market-based approach. So rationing can take on many different perspectives. Standard of care. This is key. We as physicians are taught to treat to a standard of care such that we provide the best care possible based upon our education and the treatment that other physicians similarly trained and similarly situated would provide. Anything less would be negligent, would be less than the appropriate standard of care until we come to an emergency situation, to a disaster. Then we have to practice the highest reasonable standard of care under the given circumstances. Now it becomes contextual. The standard of care depends upon that context in which the emergency is occurring and the disaster has happened. It's not the normal routine. It's, again, if we don't have the requisite resources, we cannot practice to the standard of care to which we have been trained as physicians. So we have to practice to the standard of care based upon the context. Crisis standards of care. There's a substantial change in operations and the level of care. It is justified by the circumstances. It may be declared by the state, may be declared by the federal government. It persists throughout a sustained period, and it enables specific powers and protections. Expectant care has an ethical basis in settings of severe injuries and resource shortage. What comes into play? Non-maleficence and justice, which is the prudent rationing of available care. Fairness. We seek to provide care that's based on fairness. We want it to be equitable. We want everyone to participate in this, and we want it to be governed by rule of law. However, the key to keep in mind is based on context of the emergency and the disaster. And it's also based upon what resources are available. Core ethical challenges. We're talking here about expectant care. When we talk about expectant care, we're going to provide care to individuals that gives them comfort if we don't have the resources to provide greater care for them. So we're going to maintain comfort for them. We may have to withdraw care from certain individuals because of the limited resources. So triaging becomes critical. Who are the individuals for whom we have to provide just comfort care? Who are the individuals for whom we can provide care that will allow them to return to health? This becomes then a very difficult ethical decision. This is not euthanasia. We are not saying that, okay, these folks, we are going to assist their exit and create for them a celestial discharge. We don't do that. This is not euthanasia. We provide the palliative care, we provide the comfort care, and that's part of the triage in an emergency. The AMA joint statement has stated that we will provide the best care we can based upon the circumstances and the context of the disaster. Use of limited resources fairly. We want to achieve the greatest benefit we can with the resources we have. We want to maintain our ethical obligations, and we want to provide comfort to the individuals who are injured and ill. We want our decisions to be based upon consistent approach, bless you, to the patients in the context of the situation. We want to be transparent. We want individuals to understand this is the reason we're providing this type of expectant care. And we want to avoid ad hoc decisions by individuals. Again, We want an organized approach to treating in a disaster. That's the reason you're here, to be trained so that you understand what to do in this type of a situation, so that we don't have 50 healthcare providers providing 50 different treatment approaches to the patients. We want to have an organized, standardized treatment approach. What is the first level of civil support in disasters? First level. It is. It's local. And you all, I know if I hit the button, does it bring up the answer? Let's see. It does. It's local. Remember, emergencies and disasters start locally. And then we can move them to the state. And then the state, through the governor, can, through the Stafford Act, go to the president to then enlist FEMA, or can go through the Secretary of Health and Human Services. What is isolation? Remember, we talked about quarantine, isolation, social distancing, and curfew. What is isolation? It is. You are right. It is separation of ill people. Remember, quarantine is separation and restriction of the movement of healthy exposed people. Social distancing is shutting down events and activities. Curfew is limiting the time in which individuals may participate and be out in activities. However, isolation is separating those known to be ill or infected from the rest of the community. Standard of care in disasters. It is. Remember, context. We talked about this. Standard of care is all contextual, based upon that emergency. Any questions? If there are no questions, lesson summary. State and federal response. It's tiered and coordinated. Remember, local goes to state. State then can go to federal. And also notice that we have coordinators within all three of those systems working together. The ethical framework, the 3 R's. Responsibility to treat. Restrictions and resources. Resources, allocation of scarce resources. Standard of care always depends on the context. However, we must avoid willful, wanton, and gross negligence. And now, if there are no other questions, without further ado, am I correct? I believe that earlier on this evening, it may seem like 4 or 5 hours ago, you selected, unbeknownst to any of us in this room, a date. You wrote that date down, and that's good. You have that on a piece of paper. And I believe, and I don't want you to even say it or repeat it, but I do believe you selected a date. Am I right? You selected a date earlier. And I have a deck of cards. A deck of cards with very large faces printed on the front. So even those of elderly years, such as myself, can read the faces. Shuffling up the deck so that hopefully these cards are as mixed up as I am. Now, I'm going to ask, if I may, and please note, I'm not selecting the aisle folks because I'm seeking to cause them more stress and feel as if they're in an emergency or disaster. No, in fact, I'm selecting the aisle because it's easier to access. So I'm going to ask, if you will, just to say stop at any time. Very good. I'm going to ask you, please, without looking, to remove that card, just set it down. Yes, face down. You could have had any card in the deck. That was the card you selected at random. Is that correct? You selected a date at random, and you selected a year at random. Now, I'm going to ask, if I may I ask you to come forward? Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you. I'll have you rise up before time and in these days. Please, a round of applause for our colleagues. May I hand you this marker?
Okay.
Thank you. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you in a moment, I'll have folks call out a number, and then I'm going to have you write a number into that box. And I'll just give you random numbers. But I'm going to have members of our group call out these numbers, the space number, okay? So I'm going to ask somebody, if they will, please, to call out a space number. 11. Space number 11. I'm going to ask you, if you will, 11, if you'll put in 603. And how about another space?
5.
I'm sorry?
5.
5. Space 5. Would you please put in 587? How about another space?
7.
7. We'll concentrate on that. Number 7, what I want you to do, if you will, is please put 435. Another space.
13.
I'm sorry?
13.
13. I'm going to ask you, please, on 13, if you'll put 702. 1. I'm going to ask you, please, to put 534. Another space, please.
15.
15. Please put 212.
2.
2. 405. Very good. If you want 3, how about 3? 686. How about 4? How about 311? How about 9? 113. Please, other numbers. I'm just throwing them out there. But
14.
Number 14, if you will. 14, how about 633?
8.
Number 8, how about 504?
16.
16, how about 389?
6.
How about for 6? 6, how about 410?
10.
10, how about 488? What have we got left? 12. If we have 12 left, how about 732? Okay, now, random numbers that have just been filled in. Interestingly enough, you selected a date. We have no idea what your date is. Is that correct? Very good. Now I'm going to ask, does someone have a cell phone?
Yeah.
Okay, anyone has a cell phone, would you please do me a favor, and would you please add these numbers, 4 numbers across, and tell our colleague what number that comes up to. Okay, if you'll please put 1,936. Excellent. Would you please add this column across? 1936. Would you please add this column down? And tell us what this adds up to, straight down. 1936. Would you please add this diagonal across and tell us what it adds up to? 1936. Would you tell us what this diagonal adds up to? 1936. Would you please add these four numbers together and tell us? Yes. How about these four? Yes. How about these four in the center? 1936. Would you please announce out loud and hold up your piece of paper and tell us what date you thought of, what year, at random?
You there? 1936.
1936. Thank you. Now I'm going to ask, you have a calendar that you're holding on to, yes? I'll have you please remove the rubber band. And then I'm going to ask you to open the calendar, and as you leaf through, you're going to find something very interesting inside the calendar. Every date has a playing card written in the space randomly. They're in random, totally shuffled deck order, am I right?
Yep.
Now, you selected a date. I don't remember what it was. What was the date you selected?
September 25th.
September 25th. I'm going to ask you please to turn to September 24th. I want you to turn to September 24th.
No.
September 24th, would you please tell us what the card would have been had you selected September 24th?
The 7 of spades.
7 of spades, but you did not select September 24th, did you?
No.
No. I'm going to ask you now, if you will, please to tell us what the card would have been if you selected September 26th?
8 of clubs.
8 of clubs. But you selected September 25th, is that correct?
Yeah.
Would you please tell us what card is there at September 25th?
4 of diamonds.
4 of diamonds. Now, we shuffled a deck of cards. At random, you selected a card from this shuffled deck. 1936, speaking of disasters, we were cruising into World War II. Much was happening. You selected a card at random from this deck that had been shuffled. You selected a date at random, and when you did, you selected September 25th. The card randomly written there was a 4 of diamonds. Would you please tell us now, and hold up your card, what was the card you selected at random? It was a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you all for allowing me to share with you medical legal issues and disaster situations. Thank you. Thank you.